Hi there and welcome to today's Future Orchards presentation. I'm Nic Finger from Fruit Help based in Victoria. I'm joined by Craig Hornblow based in sunny Nelson in New Zealand from AgFirst. The title of today's presentation is Orchard Data, Average Isn't Good Enough. So what does that mean and what exactly is orchard data? So as we move into the next slide here, we've got a list of orchard data types that you might currently be collecting and often at an actual value. So bins per block, you'll have an actual value. The fruit per tree, you're counting a subsample. So you'll tend to work off an average possibly or a bit more, but you're only counting a very small percentage of the total trees in the orchard. The clusters per tree, again, a subsample. Your costs, typically an absolute value. Your fruit maturity, again, a subsample. And your post-harvest data being your pack outs, which is again an absolute value. So when we're looking at this data, we're often looking at a combination of absolute values, averages, which are summary statistics. And today we're going to talk a little bit about why these averages aren't necessarily telling you the whole story or how you're not quite using your orchard data to the best of its ability. So my first example here is two trees. So quite an extreme example, as we can all tell. This is a Fuji tree, one tree on the left of the screen there, a very light crop, one tree on the right, a very heavy crop. And it actually looks like two, but there is four trees in there, believe it or not, four separate stems. And we've got some counts. So there's four trees here, and my target in this orchard is 115 fruit per tree. The first tree on the left has 21 fruit on it. The second tree, 13, so well under our target. The third tree, that little short one that's absolutely dripping in fruit, has 182, and the larger tree to its right has 232. The average per tree here is 112 fruit, 97% of our target, so pretty good. Unfortunately, the average is lying to us. So if I just got my counts, combined them all up and looked at the average, I thought I'm pretty much on target and I'm pretty happy. If we look at the variance in that data set, we've got a range of 11% of target all the way through to 201%. So the reality is we've got completely undercropped trees that will produce very early maturing fruit, large with probably some storage disorders, and some very heavy trees that will struggle to colour, be undersized and not hit our market expectations. So whilst it didn't look too bad looking at just the average, we've actually got a major problem with a significant management task. So what should you be looking at then? The average isn't necessarily good enough. And as we move into the next slide, the thing that I'd suggest is that we need to be looking at both the lower number, so in that previous slide, the very light tree, and the upper tree. In that particular case, we'd be better to split out the two tree types and manage them differently. But it raises the question, what is an acceptable upper and lower threshold for fruit per tree? Not every tree is going to hit that 115 fruit target. And from there, we have to say, what is acceptable? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? 20, 30, 50? There's a point where we know that it isn't going to help. And we need to be looking at the variance around our data set, which is just a fancy word for the spread of the data. We want this variance to be relatively low because low variance will mean more consistent fruit size, better maturity, more consistent maturity, and a fruit quality that is more consistent across the line. Basically, more data is going to give us a better picture of this variance. And rather than just looking at the average, looking at the complete spread of data, we'll have a better understanding of what we are managing. So when it comes to managing data, we need to be thinking about what are we collecting and what's important. It is not always the same. So take, for example, a soil test. Is it about the actual data or the trend of the data? The fruit size. Is it about the actual value? Yes. The trend of the data? Yes. And the variation within the data. Crop loading, the actual point data, yes, it's important. The trend of that data, the variation of that data, but also the location within the orchard. And when it comes to water or irrigation management, again, the actual values are important, but the trends, variation, location within the orchard, and the resolution, be that hourly, daily, weekly, or monthly are all critical. And if we capture data in the right way, we can do all of this, but it's about finding data that is fit for purpose. So Craig, I'd like you to talk now a little bit about hand thinning, which is coming up, and how we can do it accurately and move from a basic, numbers on paper beyond that into information, I guess.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, what we want to do here is talk about manual thinning, hand thinning, as a case study in terms of data management. And it's a task that's really topical at the moment, and we need to think about it in terms of doing it accurately, doing it consistently. There's monitoring our progress. There's issues in terms of managing staff in this whole process. There's location, whether it's location in the orchard, location within the tree, we need to actually address and target specifically. We need good data to do this quickly. And what I like to talk about is personal signatures. We need to avoid personal signatures within our orchard, that we're trying to get our staff to do the same job, just not variation between row to row, depending who's on it. And when you look at these three images I've got up here, people capture the data in different ways. The first one up there is a piece of green tape tied in a tree that I ripped off the other day. That talked about a count was 313, and that was post thinning, and the target was 180 fruit a tree. And you went further down the row and there was another tag that was over 300. So they were counting and they were giving numbers and making identifiable, but they weren't adjusting anything in terms of the target. Sometimes people just have a notebook and they're scribbling all these numbers down as an individual supervisor, and that number's sitting with them and I'm managing it how they see fit. And then they'll have a break at smoker time and they'll write an average down usually, and they'll just say, oh, the average is 78 in this case of that data set. Something Nick found the other day is someone's trying to present their data, they just hang the clipboard in the tree with the counts they've been doing, and the owner or someone else can come along and then just pick that data up quickly. So they're trying to transfer the data within the business to a degree. But what we need to do is try and create information out of the data we're capturing. We need to improve the way we're actually managing the data that we're already capturing. And sometimes you can do this, the Holy Grail is doing this automatically and everyone thinks this is going to be fantastic, but we're doing all this manually anyway. So how can we improve on that situation? And if we can actually then capture this manual data and manage the data in a way that's accessible and that we can manipulate it in some ways, we're creating information that's going to help the supervisor in the field do a better job, the owner have confidence that the job's being done well, and it can also direct focus, and we can also create visual representations of the data set to improve the speed of how it's managed and actioned. So if I take those same numbers that we talked about that were in that notebook before, and then just up there on the left, they're just a series of 13 numbers and someone scribbles those on. If we then present them just in a graphical form, it's a bit of a Manhattan, it's up and down. If we talk about what the target was 70 fruit per tree in this particular example. But the average is 78. So we're 11% above the target, which is probably okay, but it's still over the whole orchard, that might be a little bit high in terms of objectives. But if you look at that data again, 40% of the counts are greater than 100%, 120% above the target. And that's going to create those issues that Nick talked about earlier in terms of those high counts are going to delay maturity, impact on colour, possibly impact on internals and other aspects of fruit quality. So we have to get this consistent, and visually representing data helps us do that. So when we're trying to input data or we're trying to capture it, we need to think about the different aspects we want to capture. Sometimes we're just capturing the actual count. But when we've looked at this, we're saying, look, the timing of when that count was done is really important, because we're doing pre-thinning, post-thinning, or secondary thinning counts, and you want to look at the data in different ways. You could be trying to track an individual thinner, so why not record who's doing the job? The tree characteristics, sometimes we'll say, are these trees full canopy, half canopy? Are they different than the norm in some way? Where's the location of the tree within the block? What are the targets? We can capture that ahead of time. The thresholds, can we create tram lines to keep the supervisor or the counts and the adjustments within a series of tram lines to maintain our target? Does sort type come into play in variable blocks? Do we adjust our targets? And then we just have different block information and history that might help us. So what we've done at AgFirst and Nelson is tried to create just an app that we can put on our phone. We've done this simply through Google App Sheets, and there's a process in there which is a relatively free app system. And we created an app that just, instead of using a notebook, we can record exactly the same information within a phone-based system, and we can share that across the business at all sorts of levels. So we can record the variety in the sub-block. We can actually record the count within the tree, and we can set that up to be a whole tree count, a top, a bottom. You could do Y1, Y2. And then in that third clip there, you can see that you can do the timing, where the location is in a row, and actually who's doing the job. So there's a range of things we can capture, and that's just adding a little bit more information to what we're already doing. And if we switch from pen to paper in terms of creating this information flow, it's going to improve clarity of information. We're going to reduce errors, because of that. Every time information is transferred from manual into a digital system, or manual and into a digital system, there's a chance for error. It creates transparency because everyone in the business can actually have access and can do that. And accountability. So if all that information is available and I can take action on it, and you know who's done the job, it creates that accountability. Just that brief note about Google Drive, we've created this app, but actually I know a number of growers are using quite simple tools, and they're just actually sharing a spreadsheet across the business and across supervisors. So there's different ways of doing it, not going to the whole expense of creating some sort of app. But this particular app that we've developed is saying, so we can have targets and standard deviation. It can be linked in with a forecast, so we can look at yield estimation and location, because on the phone we've got the GPS, so we can see where each of these accounts have been taken. And we can create the focus, because we can actually say who or where it is in terms of the count. And this is just a quick screenshot showing the target number was 118. The actual average count was 119. There was 48 counts taken. And if we put an average size in there as a target size, and the background information around that, we know that block's estimated to have 214 bins. And then because we've captured this data in a digital form, we can actually manipulate it and look at it in different ways. We can look at just the individual block averages and their standard deviation and understand it. And the same information can be presented just graphically in a bar chart with a few whiskers showing the variation. And when we can also box plot the data, which is telling us a little bit more about the data set in terms of the spread and the median and the average. So once you've got it captured digitally, there's all these very simple processes that will actually add value and create information and improve decision making. So just another one about this location tracking. So you've got the GPS pin in there. You can look at these samples. You can see where they've been taken. But if we've recorded top bottoms of the tree within the counts, we can actually get a split about where the distribution within the tree is. And so that might change the structure of how we set the thinners up. We might say, look, we need to get more platforms into the blocks. We need more people on platforms, less people on the ground, or vice versa. And then you can see graphically that whole range in the bottom where we can have top east, west, bottom east and west, and just giving us a distribution across the counts. So you're actually creating more focus, working out where the variation is and where the target needs to be in terms of achieving the job.
Very interesting, Craig. So just on that, I guess, listening to your discussion about that app, really the actual data collection in the field has not increased at all in a way. It's really just a matter of capturing it in such a way that you can do significant value addition, a little bit of analysis on the computer afterwards, which is all being fed in. But it'd be fair to say that your actual counting in the field isn't there isn't a greater labour demand there?
No, I think you're right, Nick. And I'll just go back a slide on this GPS one. You can see a nice scatter plot in there. When we were first initially using this, a lot of people aren't digitally savvy. They don't like a digital tool. So we had individual supervisors who were actually writing all their notes down. Then at smoko time, they'd be going back and sitting in their car, having a cup of tea, filling in the data. So all the GPS points were sitting in the headland. And so we lost a chunk of data. So some people are still struggling. And I think one of the things about this whole process is we can create the tools, but we have to try and make them as simple as possible so people can pick them up and use them readily and not feel like they need to double up the capture.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good way to approach it, given that distribution within the tree and everything else is becoming so critical. So a little change of track now, looking at fruit sizing. So, getting the right number on the tree is very important. Actually determining that right number is quite a challenge, but once you have it, getting that tight variation around it. But with all data collection, the end goal is critical. It doesn't matter if I've got exactly 100 fruit on the tree. If they're under that target size, I might have decided that it was going to be this size, but if it's not tracking there, we need to address it. So it's important with the data to have an end goal, have a goal, work out what you're trying to achieve with that. What are you actually going to use it for? That's probably the most important thing. So if we look at fruit sizing as a bit of an example, take the two types of data you might collect there, depending on what you're trying to achieve. In terms of hitting a target size, looking at the growth rate, which is a trend, may tell us something we need to know. So this graph on this page is from OrchardNet, just weekly measurements, days after full bloom on the bottom axis there, and the growth rate in millimeters per week as we progress, and there's a couple of years of data there. All this is 20 fruit sequentially measured. They're tagged up with a little bit of flagging tape, and someone goes around, in this case, a digital caliper. It's about 10 minutes per block on a weekly basis. So a relatively small effort, but some interesting data that can be used to intervene and possibly fertigate, irrigate, do some additional thinning, or think about decisions like retain or harvester to retard that harvest and get an extra week of sizing there. So it answers the question, should you intervene?
So Nick, one thing about the growth rate thing, I think representing growth rate is interesting, because if you plotted this just on the millimeter growth, the curve's sort of a decreasing increase of millimeter size, so it's falling away. Where if we represent the same data in a growth rate graph, we're getting a relatively linear trend with similar differences as we're falling off. So it's giving us a better sensitivity to changes in growth rather than just looking at the absolute week-to-week number.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, as an apple, for those who haven't thought about it this way before, initially when the apple's growing, it's quite a dramatic gain, but as you get larger, the weight gain per millimeter of size is quite dramatic. So we naturally see that linear regression down, but large drop-offs are a sign that something may not be quite right. And representing it in such a way that we can see, for instance, that yellow line crashing at about 150 days after full bloom. And I'd say in that case, there's probably an irrigation missed. That can be used to action something because it's presented in a way that it's obvious. Whereas on the absolute fruit size curve there, that would just have looked like a little flattening peak in the resolution needed would just not be great enough. So yeah, it's also important to present data in the correct way for what you're trying to achieve. So there's the growth rate, a trend. But fruit size isn't just about the growth rate. We also need to think about the absolute size and what that can mean at harvest. So if I get Craig to flip me onto this slide, we've got 100 plus fruit sample in this block. Looking at the final count, so in this case, a gala block, February 1st, I went and sampled 100 fruit. 2 years difference here. But if I add 12 grams by harvest for those measurements on those dates, I can see a big change in my fruit size profile. And in this case, 2021 was a much better profile, as a lot of people would know. But this helps me with some of my marketing decisions and where I may send that fruit. what's it going to mean for my pack out, my cartons per bin, and how I can use that is to possibly use something like retain or harvester, but also potentially size pick or move fruit into a different marketing window to allow myself to maximize the fruit size that is there, rather than just in that growth rate trend. Now I've accounted for the variance and I can start to understand what I'm going to have to deal with. Is it going to take a long time to fill bins because my fruit is small? Is it going to be relatively quick? And this extrapolation of data, taking a data set on the same day and moving it forward, can help to get a longer term trend as well as accounting for that variation.
But also, Nick, I think in terms of managing the data and fruit size, when you're looking at the trend data and you're just looking at growth rate, it's the same apple every week. So 20 is enough. You know, we're trying to get a distribution here. So in terms of managing data in this sequence to get a size profile, we have to increase the sample, but it's a once, maybe a twice a season job. But so the sample size and the data collection is just different for the two outcomes you required.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that probably leads into some of these newer technologies that when we're looking at a growth rate or a rate of change, smaller samples can be fine. But when we're starting to talk about variation across the entire block or area, we need to think larger sample sets, more of the orchard. It's very costly. It's not, feasible to go and count every single tree in the orchard by hand, and the accuracy will be biased, those personal signatures you mentioned earlier, Craig. But there are some new technologies that are going to help us probably with both types of trends and accounting for this larger variation within our orchards. So if we move on to having a little bit of a chat, Craig, that we had a good chat earlier, but there's some new tools for counting. They're marketed very well in a lot of cases, and it fits in with our desire as orchardists to collect more data and ideally do it cheaper, but most importantly with higher accuracy and be able to action it. So, there's multiple tools, often in the computer vision field, that are recognizing fruit from images. So to name a few, Farm Vision, PixoFarm, Green Atlas, that sort of app sort of thing that Craig was talking about, C-Tree, Aerobotics is a drone company. But most importantly, all of this data, it depends on what you're trying to achieve, whether you're trying to sample or subsample, like our tree counts that Craig mentioned earlier in the app, or whether you're trying for full sample, scanning the whole block to get an understanding of variation at a macro level and what that might mean. And I don't think they're really, not one or the other isn't necessarily the way to go. They both work, but in very different ways. So, we've got one example there of PixoFarm, predicting the diameter of fruit at harvest and the growth rate and the size class distribution. And that's done through taking photos of trees and the computer vision then segregating out fruit as well as individual fruit, photos to get a size profile, and something more like Farmtario there, which is taking a scan on a quad bike driving through the orchard. So I'll throw it to Craig now. Just what are your thoughts on these sort of new age technologies? Because there's two very different approaches there at probably quite different labour requirements as well.
Well, and I sort of look at, this is Vivid Machines on out of Ontario on the right there. And I sort of put it in the camp of Intelligent Fruit Vision and Green Atlas, where we're scanning the whole orchard and we're saying, oh, these are going to be fantastic. These are going to count our trees and are going to give us this number and this accuracy we need. But the data is always pre-task or post-task. So I go in here and scan the orchard before I'm going to hand and work out where I need to focus a little bit. And then I come after the task and I do it and I say, oh, gee, I missed row 10 to 15 is too high and I've overthinned a particular area. So those are scanning technologies have really good ability to help us with yield estimation and this broad stuff, which is really important. But one of the focuses that we had is, and especially in developing the app and looking at the type of technology with PixoFarm, is saying we want tools that are going to help the human interface in terms of doing the task. And we need the information quite quickly as we're doing the task. And I suppose and it just horses for courses, really. If you want something to help your supervisor make better decisions, identify which thinner or person within the orchard they need to work with, the scanning tools like Green Atlas or Vivid Machines won't be doing that in real time and giving us the feedback loop. So you've got to create other systems that are giving you that real-time information. But if you're after a really improved yield estimation tool, broader scale, understanding variability within a farm, where there might be risk areas in your farm for disorders or something like that, I think there's Green Atlas, Vivid Machines type solutions will have a lot of value. I'm not sure about Green Atlas, Nick, but Vivid Machines are still saying they can give a count split between the top and the bottom of the tree. And they still feel that they can separate that out in different zones, which will still be really positive. But it's still a post-task type set of information.
Yeah, and I've got an example of Green Atlas, and it can do similar segregation of the tree as well. But I think, the distinction that we're both sort of discussing here is that essentially there's two really broad things. They're both of value to the orchard, but one is about assisting the task in real time, and another is about either highlighting areas that might be a challenge or have high variation, but also to ensure a task is being done, an additional check. And I see them working quite well together in the longer term. So yeah, I can jump into an example of Green Atlas. So just a bit of a disclosure there. I've got a unit here running in Victoria this year, and essentially to give you a rough idea of what it does, basically here it's just mounted on a small mini truck about 1.5 meters wide, driving up and down every orchard row. There's a series of cameras, strobes, and a LiDAR unit on the back. Basically, these are taking photos of all the trees, and the LiDAR is scanning the canopy, basically shooting out a heap of laser beams, which gets an idea of the height, canopy density, the canopy area, but also the cameras are then taking your fruit number, size, color, how many clusters are in each piece of fruit. And then that data can be calibrated to a tree level with additional manual counting. So we're not quite away from the manual counting. Possibly on very specific types of canopy, you might get away with it, but we've still got that aspect of human interaction there. And looking at that list of data, it's quite obvious that there's a lot of data to process, and it will take time. The human eyes are very good and being able to record things, but we're only measuring a few things. This is a lot of data in a very short period of time. So this Green Atlas tool, I did run it through a block the other week, a block of jazz. It's about 20 minutes a hectare, all said and done, from sort of set up to go. And we get this data set here is our numbers. In this case, you've done total fruit, that upper and lower distinction that you just mentioned, Craig, the number of clusters per image, not per tree, but per image, the cluster size, how many fruit are in a given space of unit, hue, which is a color relation, not that relevant at this time of year, the fruitlet size, the canopy height, the average for the entire block, not just spot trees, but the entire block, the canopy area, density, and leaf area. And there's our row and tree spacing there. So quite a tall tree for that row width. And we get this histogram, this graph of data with our quartile ranges, that middle grey line being our average, and then where the data sits around that, the variance around it, and a percentage output, your constant variance and the mean. So that's not all this type of technology outputs. It also does do a heat map, which in the next slide is probably that bit more visual. Like Craig had said, visual really does assist with helping us to understand and move that into reality. This is basically apple fruitlets, so fruit counts per image, not per tree, because it's taking an image of a couple of trees at once. And to get that per tree, you would have to go back and calibrate it. But there's a few things going on here that, having some knowledge about the block, I can probably highlight. So in the top right corner there, we've got those couple of question marks. And that one's a bit of a, you drive through the block, you're spraying, or in this case, driving this unit through, and you can tell something's a bit different. But probably most interesting is there's 3 rows there, the red and the purple line on the left. And that was actually a thinning trial last year. And this is where I really see this technology coming into it, is highlighting trial work and what things may have done that you've intervened with in the orchard. But we've got 2 rows now in darker sort of blue. They're actually really heavy. They were completely thin last year. So there was pretty much no fruit in those 2 rows. And the 3rd row that's yellow below them was the unthinned control. And they were extremely heavy, and being cypress or jazz, they have not come back this year. And so it has highlighted it. In this case, there's no real rush to get into thin this block, but there is, 1, 2, and 3 odd rows that need to probably be gone through to prevent a biennial bearing issue moving forward. So that's our fruit count type of data. And if we move in, I'm still got a couple of question marks on that top corner in the right. But if we look at canopy density, and this is what we see when we're driving through the orchard on the next slide, we have a pretty consistent block on the tree counts. The variance wasn't too dramatic on the last one, but there is this weak patch, these yellow zones on canopy density. So they're not very thick. They're a little bit small, and they need some work is the short end of it. And really that top pocket of a corner, they're losing money on the block. They're not cash positive. They get sprayed, they get thinned, they get pruned, and they produce 20% of the crop load of other trees, if that. So these are a problem. And if we move on to the next slide, I actually wandered into the block and took a photo of it. And visually, if I walked up and down every row, I could find these trees as well. And I'd say, yep, there's a weak patch in rows 3 to 8, and it's about a bay long. And the trees look quite yellow and much smaller and narrower than the other trees. And yeah, I'd say I've identified this with a scan, but most people say I knew it was there. But the distinction versus driving through the block and just seeing this is that all of a sudden we can put a quantified value on it. And when we start moving into addressing this area needs special management. It will need additional fertilizer and probably some compost just to get some tree volume there, but it needs a specific look. But now we can actually go back the following year and see if that money we've spent has made any difference, or over 5 years or however long, and get that consistency and get those trees from being a loss to the orchard to being profitable. So this is where I think these tools fit in, is that identifying variation and quality of tasks, but also highlighting an issue and then sending in for additional work.
And I think, Nick, this one here is something that was visual, and you might have picked it up or you knew it. But that example you put up before, where the crop load was because of the thinning trial the previous year, you might say, well, it just had no fruit or had heaps of fruit. That might be obvious, but the subtlety in that heat map is saying, well, if I'm 30% or 40% down in terms of the crop load in that row, that would be hard to pick up visually as I'm walking through that. But the data is giving you some ability to actually create some focus about where you need to go and have a more detailed look about what the issues might be.
Yeah, and I can also see quite a good fit. Say, obviously now we're moving into leaf blowers to speed up leaf plucking, but you can measure, say, the canopy density as we approach harvest and really target labour into specific zones that the differences are quite subtle. I'd love to do the entire block, but I only have the labour to do 1/4 of it, and I can actually target it to where canopy is the densest and where I can have the biggest gain in pack out. So I think a lot of these new tools, they have great ability to highlight things we can't see or draw our attention to them. But it's a matter of finding the use cases and ensuring we actually use the data, because it's lovely to have a pretty heat map, but if you don't do anything about it, there's no point. And it's similar with the tree counts. If you don't actually use the data, you've got to wonder why you're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, just that first example I put up, when I keep seeing tags that were like 80% higher than the target, they just were continuing in the orchard. No one had taken any action. They'd done all the counting, but hadn't done anything else.
Yeah, just going through the motions, and it's intervention. The only reason we really in my opinion, should be collecting data is if we're going to use it to manage it, the whole measure to manage thing. There's just no point in collecting data for data's sake. That's a popular one at the moment, but collect data and use it, and it's not for data's sake, it's for improving your business.
Yeah. So maybe we just have another change of tack, another sort of example of data and what we think is like irrigation management and sensing tools. There's really old school stuff in terms of getting out with a pick and a spade and doing things. And then we start doing a little bit of one-off measurements, spot measurements, and we're now getting into real-time measurements with soil moisture, which is all really positive. But there's a whole new wave of new technology, and the focus now with a shift away from, augmenting the soil moisture measurements with other things that are going to help us influence tree vigor and fruit quality and fruit size. So there's a whole range of things around sap flow and denitrometers coming onto the market. Saturus is a company that we're playing around with a little bit out of Israel, and I'll show you an example in a minute. Fluoropulse, similar sort of technology, sap flow technology out of North America. Phytech taking a little bit of a hold in Australia with some interesting stuff around the denitrometer, and Netafim Superbrain in terms of the integration of the process. And I think when you look at this whole thing, so an example, just the stem water potential. It was a spot measurement, had to be in the middle of the day, consistent light levels, you had a chance to get around, and you might have had an hour and a half's window to do a good measurement and be consistent. So you were time bound and quite complicated process in doing it. And now these two companies I'm aware of, and there might be a third one coming out shortly, where they've created these sensors that they can actually put into the tree against the phloem and create a real-time sap water potential measurement. So they're combining a range of different technologies to achieve this, and then linking that with a data logger unit, which then can still be used for flow rate and temperature, weather station, and other data within the orchard. And so this sort of technology can actually just give us that real-time data that's based on the tree itself and what's happening in the tree. And then you might say, well, this is great, this is real-time. And I think one of the things that is missing in our irrigation management is actually the spatial distribution. So we might measure soil moisture in one or two places within an orchard, but it's a spot measurement. And the same with this soil water potential at the moment. This particular system is linked up with RF, so they can actually have multiple sensors around an orchard at a reasonable expense. But what's the resolution we need for this data? We can actually get the resolution every 15 minutes in terms of time, but what's the resolution we need in a spatial sense to actually keep the whole orchard up to play? So this is a space that we should be watching and thinking about. It will change the data that's flowing in to make better water management decisions going forward. Nick, do you want to share a little bit about the denitrometer work and that sort of thing in the same space?
Yeah, so Phytech's probably the most prominent, and I think with Saturus as well, your pressure bombs, your stem water potential. It just shows how far the research, these have been the gold standards in research for a number of years now to measure changes. So a dendrometer, for those who aren't familiar, is basically a very finely tuned caliper that's there all the time. But it's at the point now where it's usable in the field. Once upon a time, an expensive research tool and moved into the field. And with some clever manipulation of that data, it's not just a graph that you're pulling, but in the case of, say, Phytech, which has got a bit of popularity in the Golden Valley now and a few other regions, they've moved it to a dashboard, quite simple, red, amber, green. Is the irrigation making sense? And as orchards get to a larger scale, this type of quick look dashboard that Craig had brought up with the fruit counts becomes even more critical. So I think all the technologies, they're all great, really, but the usability and getting them to a point of simple traffic light system or quick glance and intervene or highlight an issue and then go and address it is is where they're all heading and where they need to be able to be used. Because more data can't mean more work. It needs to be more data to assist us with that work, and we want to be able to get output or information that's really good. So I think irrigation technology, if you don't have anything in the farm, you really need to be. You're often overwatering if you aren't. And many growers, take the Phytech example in the Golden Valley, they've shifted from evening irrigation into morning irrigation because they really weren't getting great efficiency out of their water use.
So just in summary, we've run through sort of three examples really in terms of fruit counting and fruit size and irrigation. But we need to collect and manage really good quality data, and then we've got to be able to use it. Hopefully we've talked a little bit about saying why average isn't good enough. We have to think about what the outcome is and whether the actual data is important, the trend of the data, the variation, the location, or the resolution. And then the key that Nic just mentioned earlier is we've got to create information about it. It shouldn't be just data for data's sake, and we can all drown in data in a whole lot of different ways. So we've got to create information, and I like that last comment Nic made. If we can boil our data down into a sense of just red, amber, green in terms of improving our decision making in that sort of sense, it will really help us achieve great results and consistently.
Yeah, and I guess one final comment, we've talked about some quite emerging technologies and a good example of creating an app and pulling data together. But Craig had mentioned when we were talking about that app, you can start really simple, rather than this year just scribbling on bits of paper and throwing them in the bottom of the ute tray or whatever you do with them. Get that data, put it in a spreadsheet, and have a bit of more of a look at it, and keep it for next year because it's really useful. So it can be overwhelming, but start small. You're already collecting some data. Just take a bit more of a look at it and make some information.
Yeah, great comments. Thanks.
Righto, thank you guys.
Okay, so we might get straight into the chat questions. And I'll start with the bottom one because I think that's quite interesting from Jesse Reader. Any good tools emerging for data overlay that you have come across?
So Jesse's talking about, Jesse maybe sent another text in terms of data lay, in terms of the integration between data sets. I think that's what you mean. And I think that's a really big space in terms of trying to integrate a whole range of data. But at the moment, there's a lot of orchard management system data sets, a lot of 3 or 4 different companies in New Zealand that are providing different tools for different growers. But nothing that really sticking solidly and saying this is an awesome tool.
Yeah, I think to a degree it's probably at the moment in the custom space with GIS web tools is probably the best solutions at the moment, like an ArcGIS web or something, and building a framework, because people are grabbing this from there and this from there and bringing them together that way through an API or something similar, because everyone's got their own systems and not everyone's going to back the same group.
Craig and Nic, are you, in your experience, are you seeing a lot of adoption of new technologies? And if so, how are growers or businesses going about choosing what they are adopting? Big question, too big?
Short answer is...
Or even actually, I'll put that out there because there are quite a few people in venues out there. Why don't I ask you, like, how are you choosing? If you're adopting technology, what are you doing? And if you're struggling maybe with questions around, is it the infrastructure? Do you not have the connectivity? There are too many options on the market. You don't know what there is that might help you make decisions. Like, what is it that might be a barrier, I guess, or to you adopting something to help you collect data? And while you're thinking about that, and don't forget, you can raise your hand and if you'd like to come and join us on screen for a discussion. Craig,
Yeah, Rose, like one of the things is, as I see, is almost critical mass. When a few growers get together and they one starts using tool, another starts using it, and then they can feed off each other to add value. So one of the examples for that is, Hectare's come along tracking bin data and at harvest and that sort of thing, and it was hitting a real pain point for the growers. But then what I saw is 2 or 3 growers started using it, and then in our situation, then the pack house thought, oh, this is quite a good way for us to get combined data. So they encouraged everyone who was supplying them to do it. So the technology has to hit a pain point. Then there's something, a lot of people don't necessarily want to be on their own, and be the guinea pig, and you've got to have some sort of track record. And then the other thing I think is the bigger businesses are going ahead, and Nic mentioned it before, that it's the customization of their own solution. They've got this real sense of what they need and what they want within their business, and it's not what that guy's got, and it's not this, and they want, and they're customizing something very specific for their own needs.
And just on the Hectare, have you got any thoughts or comments on Hectare's Spectre function for size distribution on at harvest?
I think it's a really interesting space. I think a lot of people are hoping it's going to be pretty good. We were working with a French company a few years ago, and it's very achievable because you can get the bin size gives you a reference point, and I see whether it's absolutely accurate at this stage and giving the exact data, it will be there within a year or two with high accuracy, I think, because it's a really controlled environment taking a photograph of a bin. And so we'll be able to get the calibration points we need to achieve that and achieve the accuracy with the data.
Yeah, I just think to add a comment there, it is a little bit of that time frame as well. That's at point of harvest. And there's a question or point of, getting to the pack house, whether it needs to be earlier for your purposes. Say for a grower supplier, they might be wanting to ship them small fruit somewhere else to a different pack house. So you don't want it too late in the piece and what you might do. So I think it really depends on that end goal. I think it's a good tool, but it just depends on how you want to use it and when you need to know it.
Finger's got a comment: in all of these processes, the most important person of all is the supervisor. They have to implement the goals, and therefore a key person that requires focused training to maximize results. Any comments on that? And I guess, do you feel that with these new tools, is there extra training required for staff that to operate them? Is maybe one of the concerns around them is, there's a lot of data. Who's going to do that, and how do you do it?
Oh no, I think it's an absolute, and Sue's said exactly right. If you want to digitize a piece of data, if someone's really comfortable with a pen and paper and they're just a people person and they don't like entering data and that sort of thing, it's get into an app, you're just going to kill the process. So it's important to select the right person. But again, even at a supervisor's level, you could probably break the task down. You might have someone doing the counts, entering the data, who's really skilled in that space, but then giving the outputs and the dashboard to the supervisor to take the action. So, because everyone's got different skills in the paddock. But I think generally over time, we are going to have to be better at managing data. And it's a skill, a generation from now, we won't think there's, we were saying what was the problem? Because I think, most people are used to managing their information on a phone. So it's probably a short-term window of a decade and it won't be an issue.
Yeah, but it does bring up that barrier point as far as, what are the barriers to change, whether that is, skills or training, whether that's, connectivity is the big one. WA right now is not able to join because they don't have phone reception to be able to live stream video. They don't have the bandwidth. And so you've got to look at potentially, Wi-Fi networks over the farm or even investing on signal boosters to get better reception across the whole property. Because I know for a lot of the regions on the call, you're in pretty hilly terrain and it's easy to find dropouts and black spots.
And that can be in the design of the technology too, Nic, that you can have some sort of offline system, but when you capture the data, but then when you go back to a point within the farm or the office, at least it's uploaded and dealt with, and trying to have a piece of technology like that. And then there's other people with a solution that put a Wi-Fi mesh across their farm, linking their different locations, and creating or enabling the solution to occur.
Yeah, yeah, and the usability, there's nothing worse than being down the back and you've forgotten to print off the thing that you needed to look at it at that time. And it's about how you're going to use it, I think, still, but it's a bit like the touchscreen tablet in the rain gets pretty useless pretty quick, and how you manage that. Whereas pen and paper, it might get soggy, but you can kind of work with it at times. So it's managing expectations as well as how you're going to use it, I think.
I can see at Lenswood and obviously here in Batlow and probably with you, Jess, there are a few people in the room. Do you have any questions that you've had some conversations in the room there that you might like to ask as a group? We can't see you individually, so you won't even be seen on screen very closely. Or Nick and Craig, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask of the audience?
I think we've got a hand at Batlow.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, Kevin.
Can you hear me okay, Rose?
Perfectly.
Yeah, look, just a question for Nick, because he mentioned that he's got the Green Atlas outfit at his place at the moment, or has had. Is that now a commercial service, and or do you own that equipment? What's the arrangement?
I'm leasing it currently. I'm running it commercially. If people are interested, it's probably a further discussion with me, but yes, it is under lease, and there are providers. I think in WA there's someone, and in Queensland, and the Green Atlas guys themselves. So yes, commercially I'm running it at the moment, sort of on a trial basis, but it is a lease arrangement.
Thanks for that.
And Kevin, on that, if anyone is interested in seeing or hearing more about Green Atlas, the orchard walks in the Goulburn Valley and Southern Victoria next week will have a bit more information about that from the PIPS projects. And also in Southern Vic, Nick's got his unit out there as well, if you can make it down to Victoria.
If there was enough interest, I could come up to that later.
Since we're heading on to 3 o'clock, if there are no other questions, we might wrap it up, because some of you are going out to orchards to see some apple trees and other things. So we hope you found today's presentation useful. If you've got any other questions that you would like to follow up with Nick or Craig, please get in touch with them or us in the APAL office, and we will follow up on those questions. Thank you again to Fruit Help and the AgFirst team for their involvement today. This is a Future Orchards talk that was funded by the Pink Lady. And APAL is really keen to make sure that the content of our future orchard walks and talks matches your needs and interests. And if you've got any topics that you would like to hear more about, please get in touch with us. And we wish you a productive couple of months before we regroup early next year for the next round of orchard walks. Goodbye and take care.